welcome back everyone. For those of you just joining us now, my name's Lauren Winch and I'm the manager of the Bristol Poverty Institute. I'll be chairing this session and my co-chair today is Sarah Blackmore, the BPI conference administrator, who many of you will have been in touch with and who's done a fantastic job supporting the planning and delivery of this conference, alongside the BPI senior administrator, Melanie Tomlin, who's hosting the session today. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank them both because we couldn't have done this without them. Before I introduce our first speaker, just a few words of housekeeping from us. All of our conference sessions will be recorded and posted on our YouTube platform and embedded in the BPI website. So by attending, you're consenting to being part of this recording. Although of course, most of you can't share your video and audio in this meeting format, just written comments, which we may read out on your behalf. Please ensure that you've added your name rather than being listed as guest, because the BPI team will be monitoring attendees. And we also need to know who's asking questions if we do read them out for you. The purpose of this opening session is to set the scene for discussions over the subsequent 3 days of the conference. So it will introduce different dimensions and challenges related to poverty in the 21st century in low, middle and high income countries. By bringing together a range of perspectives, we seek to improve our understanding of the causes and effects of poverty and, by extension, our ability to influence policy and practice to alleviate it. So I've asked each of our fantastic speakers or speaking pairs to talk for 10 to 15 minutes each. And I will sound a 1-minute warning alarm after 14 minutes if they're still going, just to make sure we keep to time. These presentations are intended to provide food for thought and inspiration for discussion over the course of the conference. So there'll only be a short Q&A at the end of this particular session. You do have the opportunity to ask questions for that via Zoom's Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. Due to time constraints, we might not be able to answer every question, but feel free to get in touch with the speakers after the session to continue conversation, or link up with them at one of our virtual networking sessions, or drop the BPI team a message and we'll be happy to relay those questions on to the speakers on your behalf. Some of our speakers may also choose to type a response during the course of the session through the Q&A function if that's more convenient, but in most cases we'll try and answer them live. So finally, please just be respectful. All events at this conference are being monitored and we do reserve the right to remove attendees whose comments are deemed offensive or derogatory. So on to the presentations. I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker and the director of the Bristol Poverty Institute, Professor David Gordon. David is Professor of Social Justice at the University of Bristol. He's a member of the advisory board of the UNICEF Office of Research, a member of the International Network for Research on Inequalities in Child Health, a board member of the International Society for Child Indicators, and was a fellow of the International Social Science Council's Comparative Research Programme on Poverty. David's written and edited over 100 books, papers and reports on poverty, health inequalities and social exclusion, social justice and social policy. In 2006-2007, he was given the tremendous honour of addressing the General Assembly of the United Nations about child and youth poverty. And in 2018, he had the honour of being elected as a Fellow of the British Academy in recognition of his work on poverty research. So I'll hand over to you now, David.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Lauren, and thank you all for joining us this morning for this the beginning of this 3-day conference on poverty and the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my slides. Okay. So as many of you will know, in 2015, the governments of the world came together to agree the Sustainable Development Goals. There were 17 main goals, 169 targets. And,
sorry, apologies, Dave, I can't see your slides.
You can't see my slides, oh, sorry. Share screen. What about now?
Yes, that's come up now, yeah.
Sorry. So there were 17 goals, 169 targets and 232 indicators, of which the primary goal was to try and eradicate poverty everywhere by 2030. and to leave no one behind. The Sustainable Development Goals were designed to guide economic, social and environmental policy between 2015 and 2030. And they were a very ambitious set of goals which were developed after widespread international consultation. So I'm going to briefly discuss where we find ourselves today at the beginning of 2021 and what the likelihood is that some of these ambitious goals will be met. As I said, the primary goal, the first goal, is to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030. The other subsidiary goals in there is also to reduce by half the number of people in multidimensional poverty according to national definitions. And one of the ways of tackling poverty is by the introduction of social protection floors and social security systems. And there'll be a lot of discussion about these issues over the next 3 days. Of course, many of the other 17 goals are directly related to poverty. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals are not the first time the UN has tried to have a set of ambitious social and economic policy targets. They followed on from the Millennium Development Goals that ran between 2000 and 2015. These were less ambitious goals than the Sustainable Development Goals, and on a world scale, about half of them were met. Fortunately, a reduction in extreme poverty was one of the goals that was met. One of the reasons that even half of the goals were met was because of the tremendous economic growth which occurred in China. And as you can see, China met all of its goals, and the success of China and several other states, particularly in Asia, dragged the world targets up. So that at least half of the goals were met. As I said, the Sustainable Development Goals are more ambitious and therefore harder to meet. And that was before the COVID pandemic came along. One of the innovations of the Sustainable Development Goals was to integrate the social and economic development with the need to have that on a sustainable basis, and particularly to reduce the effects of climate change and protect the environment. Unfortunately, the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century has seen the environment deteriorate across the board by and large. So here this shows how the environment has changed, particularly a number of the ones related to the Sustainable Development Goals since 1979. As you can see, greenhouse gases have been increasing, ice masses have been declining, the oceans and climate has been getting warmer, sea level has been rising, extreme weather events have been increasing, and there's been increased costs to dealing with these more severe natural disasters. One of the problems we face is that a lot of the oil and coal in the ground is unburnable if we are not to risk having catastrophic climate change. So it's estimated that of current reserves, about 741 gigatons worth of CO2, which are currently part of reserves of oil and gas companies, and fossil fuel producers, cannot really be burnt, otherwise it would lead to disastrous levels of climate change. And that is an existential threat to life. If we were to burn all the known reserves, then the areas marked in brown and purple on this map would likely become uninhabitable to human life. Their temperature would rise so much that people would not be able to survive by sweating and losing heat, and for certain parts of the year, unless you're inside with air conditioning, it would be impossible to sustain human life. And these are parts of China, India, parts of Europe, Africa, Brazil, USA, large parts of Australia. These kinds of catastrophic warming has to be avoided. Of course, one of the problems is that the value of oil and gas and fossil fuel companies depends on the value of their reserves. And they are heavily in debt to the banks. There's about 4 trillion of equity sunk into these companies. There's about 1.3 trillion in debts. And yet less than half of the proven economically recoverable oil, gas and coal reserves can be emitted by 2050. And much of the value of these companies depends on those reserves. And if they can't use those reserves, then their value will crash, and that will destabilize the whole economic system of the globe at the moment, and that would lead to a massive financial crash and an increase in poverty. So that's a real problem. One of the reasons that the global financial system is so unstable is because of the current structure of global capitalism. Although there are about 30 million businesses in the world, most of them are small shops or single person businesses. There are about 43,000 transnational corporations in the globe where most of the economic activity takes place. But only about 737 firms, mostly banks, control the whole of global capitalism by having controlling shares in these transnational corporations. And these have a network structure of ownership. So each of these firms owns large chunks of the others. So if one of these firms fails, like Lehman Brothers did in 2007, then the whole system is very unstable and begins to crumble. There is a problem with increasing global warming, in that the impacts are predicted to lead to massive rises in food prices, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa by 2080 if global warming goes unchecked. And by 2080, unless we can attenuate global warming, food prices will rise by 17%. And so the World Bank estimates that the number of people in extreme poverty is likely to be highly impacted by climate change unless we change course. And without climate change that we're projected to have, there would be about 900 million people born this model scenario. But with climate change, that would increase by over 100 million because of agricultural food prices, problems of health, reduced labor productivity, and increased natural disasters. Now, that was before the pandemic. What we know about pandemics and epidemics is that they have always impacted harshest on the poor and most vulnerable. That's been shown by archaeological research and by historic research and by modern economic research. There have been a number of estimates about what the likely impact of the pandemic is going to have on global poverty. Here's an example of one that was made last year, early in the pandemic. And the estimates depend on the impact it has on global production, are estimated to increase global poverty by between 85 million and 580 million, using the extreme poverty measure that the World Bank uses of $1.90 a day equivalent. Here's a more recent estimate from January from the World Bank of global projections. So they were projecting that from 2015, when they estimated that 740 million people were in extreme poverty, and the trend line down to 2030 was to get down to 588 million. But with the COVID pandemic, they estimate now that by 2021, we'll be back to where we were prior to the Sustainable Development Goals, somewhere between 730 million and 750 million. So the pandemic is adding a massive amount of global poverty using the most extreme measures of poverty. And these are relatively optimistic scenarios. It could be even worse. What we know from the analyses of pandemics and epidemics during the 21st century, looking at SARS, H1N1, MERS, Ebola, and Zika, and the impact on 64 countries, rich, middle income, and low income countries, is that it tends to increase inequality and increase the incomes of those the richest in society and decrease the incomes of those at the bottom of society. So at year zero of the pandemic, when the pandemic is occurring, the rich tend to benefit on average by a small amount, 1%. But following the pandemic, their incomes tend to grow relative to the rest of society. And on average, in the 64 countries looked at, it saw the richest 10% income rise by about 6%. By contrast, the poor see their incomes fall during a pandemic on average by about 3%. And then over the subsequent 5 years, their incomes tend to decline by 10 or 12%. And if unless there's government interventions that stop these patterns that have occurred in the past from taking place, then we're going to see a massive rise in global inequality and a massive rise in poverty. And that's true if you look at the top and the bottom 20% as well. We already start from a very unequal basis. The world is highly unequal. And if you look back at the economic growth that's occurred between 1980 and 2016, that 35-year period, what we find is that the richest 1% on the planet captured 27% of all the economic growth of the planet. The bottom 50% did capture some of that economic growth, and that was largely due to the massive boost in the economy in China and some Vietnam and Malaysia and South Korea and other Asian countries. But a lot of the world's population in the middle only saw its real incomes increase by a relatively small amount compared to particularly the very richest. And we live in a situation today where the richest 1% own more wealth than the rest of humanity put together. And that disparity is growing. So research by the House of Commons a few years ago argued that if current trends continue, this was before the pandemic, then the richest 1% would own about 2/3 of the global wealth by 2030. That may be accelerated by the pandemic. Now, what we've seen is a massive increase in deaths. We've passed about 3 million deaths estimated from the pandemic. And even in a country like the UK, where we have a national health system and have had successful vaccinations, if you look back to the beginning of the 20th century, what we saw is a massive decline in the number of deaths with the invention of penicillin, some clearance, modern medicine, number of deaths due to infectious and parasitic diseases, which remain low through most of the 20th and the second half of the 20th and 21st century of the NHS. And what we saw at the end of the 2020 was a massive increase in infectious diseases, and this has now gone up to back to 19th century levels. We've seen 150,000 deaths. Unfortunately, there have been twice as many deaths in the poorest areas as there have been in the richest areas across the UK, and that pattern seems to have been echoed across the world, unfortunately. And this has led to a massive increase in problems of the financial impact on adults and families in the United Kingdom, and we'll hear more about that later today. And about 1 in 5 adults in the UK have had to cut back on essentials such as food, clothing, and medical care and housing. And they increase in the number of people with low financial resilience, according to the government's Financial Conduct Authority. So I'll leave you with the words of Charles Darwin, who knew quite a lot about biology and unfortunately also about poverty. He argued that if the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, then great is our sin. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you very much for that fantastic presentation, David. And hopefully that'll really got people thinking about the various dimensions of poverty in 2021 and how we can explore them together over the coming days. So our second speaker is Mr. Peter Matajic. Peter is the Deputy Director for Evidence and Impact at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, where his team provides the knowledge base to underpin and assess JRF's outcome plans and real-world impact. Before joining JRF, Peter worked for almost 20 years in the civil service, where he led on a number of areas, including on the UK government's annual poverty statistics. So over to you, Peter. So we can see your screen, but we can't hear you at the moment.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, everybody. And sorry, I'm just going to sort myself out. Thank you. Cool. So hopefully you can see my slides okay still?
We can see your note version of the slides rather than the main one, which was up a second ago.
Yeah, okay, no problem. Is that okay now?
Yes, that's full screen.
Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry everybody about technical troubles. So I'm from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and I've got a bit about sort of what we are and who we are. So basically, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation was established over 100 years ago, and our mission is to inspire action and change to solve UK poverty. So we've got our 4 outcomes. So the first one is that more people want to solve poverty, understanding and take action. And events like this are brilliant for enabling us to do that, because obviously one of the main things that you need to actually establish a social change is the desire to make changes. And as David's suggested, there's great evidence that change is needed, but what we need is more people to want to make that change and to make the behavioural changes possible. But then we need to think about, well, what are the kind of solutions that we need to get, reduce poverty. And so our 3 outcome areas, we call them in Joseph Rowntree Foundation, in order to tackle poverty are as follows. So the first one is more people find a route out of poverty through work. So better, well-paid, more jobs. More people find a route out of poverty through a better system of social security. So this is a more effective, more compassionate benefit system. And then finally, more people live in a decent, affordable home, not sort of facing insecurity of tenure and not having to pay a lot of their income on housing costs. So that's sort of our mission as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. We also fund a lot of research and a lot of sort of action in terms of participation and other ways of actually solving poverty. So please look at our website for further details of all our work. Here I'm going to talk about our annual report. So we do an annual report on poverty in the UK, and this will gives a sort of a state of the nation report on what is poverty in the UK. And I've updated these slides to reflect the latest poverty data published by the UK government, which came out in March. So what was the poverty? And so the data set that was out in March covered the year 2019-2020. So it goes right up to the start of the pandemic, but doesn't cover the pandemic period. So what I'm going to do over the next few slides is give you the poverty pre-pandemic picture, but then I'm going to talk a bit about, well, what might happen afterwards. So even before the pandemic, and you'll have seen from David's slides, the evidence is that the pandemic is not going to be good for poverty. 22 in every 100 people are in poverty. And here I'm defining poverty as being below 60% of the median income, the middle person's income, adjusted for household costs, household composition, and that's measured after housing costs has been deducted from income. So that's our definition of poverty. And there'll be other measures of poverty discussed and other concepts of living standards in other presentations. So given the definition, so 22 in every 100 people were in poverty on that basis. But then if you look at other groups, the rate is much higher. So 27 people in every 100 people in a family containing a disabled person was in poverty. And this is, and the definition is based on an income, including disability benefits as income, whereas quite a lot of the times those disability benefits are actually paying the extra costs of disability. And without, there's versions of this data without those being included as income, and then about 3 in every 10 people in families containing disabled people are in poverty. So then moving up, 31 in every 100 children were in poverty. So that's about 1 in 3, and that's been increasing over time, as has the proportion of pensioners in poverty as well. Moving on to poverty by different ethnic groups. So 40 in every 100 people in households headed by someone of Black ethnicity were in poverty. That increases to 47 in every 100 if someone headed in households headed by someone of Pakistani ethnicity. And then it's over half for people in households headed by someone of Bangladeshi ethnicity. And those last two statistics are despite 25 years of falling poverty rates for those groups. So they were, I think it was sort of almost 6 or 7 out of every 10 households, people in households headed by those people of those ethnicities were in poverty back in the mid 1990s. So there's been a lot of progress, but there's still a heck of a lot of progress to continue with that. So what do we know about poverty levels during the pandemic? So I think the main thing to say is it's very uncertain about the poverty levels during the pandemic because there's two opposing sets of forces, some dragging poverty up and some dragging poverty down. So what's increasing poverty? So what we know is one of the main impacts of the pandemic has been on the employment rates. So there's been a higher level of unemployment and obviously massive numbers of workers furloughed as well. And it's also reduced earnings in a lot of sectors, partly because of that furlough where people are receiving 80% of their earnings often. So those are the things sort of pulling poverty upwards. We also have some effects pulling poverty downwards. So the first thing is something that David mentioned. The governments do have some control over the situation and can, take steps to help ameliorate the effects. So one of the things that the UK government did back in May 2020, they increased the rate of universal credit and tax credits by £20 a week, and also reset the local housing allowance to actually be based on housing costs again. So it had sort of become dislodged from actually, the housing costs in an area had been frozen for many years. And I'll talk about how the effects of that later on in the slides. But basically it was reset to the 30th percentile of rents in an area. So that's a kind of positive effect. There's also a kind of because this is partly an inequality measure, and if the middle person's income falls faster than the person on low income, then poverty will also fall. So sort of almost a second order effect of sort of the average falling also reduces poverty. So that's sort of what happened during the pandemic. Now, what's going to happen afterwards? Well, what we're worried about is that those higher benefit levels are kind of time limited. So you might have heard our campaign about Keep the Lifeline, which we were running with sort of towards the budget in March. And we were sort of successful and happy with the Chancellor because he extended those benefits for 6 months. But we were really hoping for those to be made permanent because you'll see from future slides, the benefit system is inadequate in this country and it needs to be reset at that higher level. So we'll be calling for the Chancellor to extend the Lifeline and make it permanent as closer to the time. And then other things, as David's presentation shows, generally seems to be that the higher income people recover quicker, and so the lower median incomes may fade out, and then the higher unemployment and lower earnings may well be affecting the lower parts of the income distribution for a longer period of time. So the prospects of poverty rising is quite high in the future. So that's sort of the statistics, but one of the things that we're really keen on, I'm really looking forward to the presentation by Katie and Tracy as well, is basically to get beyond the statistics and actually hear the voices of people with low income. So one of the things we did with our report was have something called the Grassroots Poverty Action Group, which was people with lived experience of poverty talking about their experiences. And here are some quotes from that work, which has really brought the kind of statistics to life and really helped us as analysts to get beyond the statistics and actually think about the people affected and direct the analysis to those lived experiences. So just to go through some of the kind of details before coronavirus. So what we saw was actually the big growth in poverty was actually in working families pre-pandemic. So you'll see basically this chart shows since the mid-90s, more and more people were going to work each day, still being in poverty. And part of this was a positive effect because employment was growing over that period. So that was good. But what it showed was some of those jobs that were being created weren't paying enough to take somebody out of poverty despite doing full-time hours. So that's something that we certainly think needs to be looked at and addressed going forward in terms of the recovery. And what's more is that the poverty rates were highest for some of the hard hit sectors in the pandemic. So we know that retail was shut down for many, many months, and accommodation and food, which is hotels and restaurants, was also shut down for many months and still isn't open to a full extent. And those have got higher rates of poverty as well. So these workers who have got a higher chance of being furloughed were already very likely to be in poverty, well, more likely than the average worker to be in poverty before the pandemic. So one of the things we're thinking about is what would a recovery for all look like, not a two-tier recovery. So that's something that's really important to us. And what we see, and maybe that's a theme for the conference, is basically the coronavirus puts the greatest pressure on workers already at higher risk of poverty. So it's sort of almost, exploits any kind of, those people who are sort of, more susceptible to the effects of poverty. The coronavirus seems to almost have a kind of laser guided missile to some of those sort of effects. So I think that's something that we just need to look out for, and that's why we think the government action should be focused on those groups to make sure that that they are sort of being protected from the worst effects of the coronavirus. So that's sort of the story on the labour market. Looking at the actual sort of government support over time, well, the theme for the last decade pre-pandemic was a period of austerity. And so there were a range of sort of ad hoc benefit changes, like the 2-child limit, like the benefit cap, like the local housing allowance being sort of not reflecting housing costs anymore. But this chart just shows one of the main effects, which is basically what happens to benefits year on year. And so if that line was at 100 all the way through, basically benefits had stayed at the same level compared to inflation over the whole period. But you see the line isn't staying at 100 all the way through. We had 2 periods, one where benefits were rated by 1% a year, and obviously inflation was higher than 1%, so it goes down a bit there. And then you'll see a massive acceleration where benefits weren't rose at all, even in cash terms, whilst inflation was obviously eroding the value of those benefits. So by the end of the period, benefits had lost about 9% of their value just through the benefit freeze alone for those benefits that were frozen. And as I said, some families will have seen a much more of a kind of increase compared to had none of these policies been in effect, if they've had sort of 3 children or in an area where housing costs have increased a lot over the time. So this is the kind of context for the benefit increase, that so far temporary benefit increase put in last year. And one of the things that we think is basically that change needs to, that increase in benefits needs to be maintained, and also just an investigation about, well, what, some of those changes are just going to increase poverty. The 2-child limit in benefits is going to increase poverty, and this is at the time when the number of people on universal credit has increased dramatically, so it's nearly doubled in the last year. So there's a lot more people likely to be claiming benefits and needing government support, and we think benefits are part of the solution that can help unlock poverty's constraints. And I suppose so I think that's where we think on benefits, it's sort of really a critical area of where the government can have an effect. So then looking at private renters, so basically we've got more private renters in the housing stock. So around the turn of 1998-99, about 1 in 10 households were privately rented. By 2018-19, that had doubled to 2 in 10. And they have very high rates of poverty. So about 1 in 3 private renters were in poverty. Social renters have a similar kind of poverty rate, and buying them mortgages and own outright have lower poverty rates, partly because of the lower housing costs that they have. And part of the reasons why that is a problem is that nowhere near enough social housing is being built. So the blue bar at the bottom represents how many, what proportion of social housing is needed, and that's how many were built in the latest data point that we have available. So a very small fraction of what's required. And what that means is more and more people are in the private rented sector, which, as well as being expensive, is also quite insecure as well. So people can be forced to move and have got not a lot of power in terms of security of tenure. So that's something else that we think needs to be addressed. So I think one of the things I want to end on is sort of, again, where do these people renting work? So we can see that, again, they are more likely to be working in sectors that are hard hit by coronavirus. So manufacturing, accommodation and food, wholesale and retail, and arts and entertainment. So they're much more likely to be working in those sectors than someone who's buying with a mortgage. And so the final thing is, so, I suppose that's sort of where we are now. But what we want to also do is think about, well, what do we want the future to look like? So I think one of the things I'd like us all to think about over the couple of days is sort of, well, what changes are needed? So we need the recovery to be led by the creation of good jobs. We need to make sure people can, if they lose their job, access employment support and get back to work as soon as possible. And also that those jobs are paying a decent enough wage so that they are actually jobs that take somebody out of poverty. We need to strengthen the benefit system, and we need to increase the amount of low-cost housing. So that's the sort of solutions that we think are necessary for ending poverty in the UK. Thank you for all your attention, and thank you for a great event. Looking forward to the rest of it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Peter. Some really interesting reflections there, and really good to hear about the work that GRF's doing with the voices of lived experience of poverty, which leads us really nicely onto our third set of presentations. So this is actually from a pair of speakers who are here representing the Addressing Poverty Through Lived Experience Collective, APLE for short. So we've got Katie Goldstraw, who is an administrator and volunteer coordinator for APLE, and Tracy is an APLE collective founding member, who is also with the organisation Thrive Teesside. APLE collective formed in 2018 and has been campaigning for the voice of people with lived experience of poverty to be heard ever since. Their campaigns have been focused around the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty in October and the impact of the digital divide on people with lived experience of poverty. So I'll hand over to you now, Katie and Tracy.
Thank you. So thanks for the introduction, and yeah, we hope I can live up to it. And thanks obviously for Peter previously, who said he's really looking forward to us moving beyond the statistics and putting some lived experience at the heart of this. So yeah, my name's Tracy. I'm from Thrive, and we're sat here in sunny Teesside, Stockton, a post-industrial community that's blighted obviously by the change in the economic landscape and the way jobs and the economy's gone. But also we're one of the founding members of Apple, and if I miss anything out, Katie's going to jump in and keep me on track. So Apple, we call it Apple. It's addressing poverty with lived experience, so of those people who suffer poverty or socioeconomic disadvantage. And our collective has been growing now for a number of years, and our values and actions are grounded in the lived experiences of people who are living in a deprived area, people who are suffering disadvantage and struggling to realise their potential due to the structural constraints and the ineffective policies that have happened over however many years. So we're aiming to create a sustainable grassroots network right across the UK. We aim to raise awareness of the barriers and the factors and the issues that continue to keep people locked in poverty. We aim to reduce stigma, challenge the narrative within the media, work with others. It's about merging our areas of expertise with others so that we can eradicate those issues that keep people trapped in poverty. So we're a diverse group. I think we've got about 11 member organisations and individuals at the moment, and we are quite representative of the wider population. So our membership includes people who work and don't work, low-paid workers, and one of the comments made earlier is work is not always the route out of poverty. Work can trap people even more so, having it particularly with universal credit, although there'll be an argument against that. Our lived reality just says that is particularly difficult for communities. We have people who are reliant on social security benefits. I like to call them social security claimants. We have people who've struggled with addictions, people who've been homeless, people who are seeking asylum, and that's just a small minority of the groups, and it's probably there's a lot more members. But behind that label of whether people have been made homeless or whether they've been an addict or whether they're on a benefit, it's people. That's it. It's our community. At the end of the day, we're united and we're expert. We have a range of expertise, so we can organise ourselves and amplify our voices. What we don't have is the power at the moment, and that, you know, we're unable to really grab hold of that civic responsibility and that duty to ensure that our voice can influence policy. So we're relying on people who are in power or people who can make decisions to allow us to sit around the table. Now that's not right. And we don't want people to allow us. We want that to be part of the course. And I want to tell you today as well that poverty actually does stare you in the face every single day. We're not a statistic, we're not a number, and we're not somebody to be researched. We would like to assert our rights to co-produce the research that would make a difference in our communities if that research can impact on policy. And it was good to hear in the introduction earlier on that and part of the opening speech that there is a value placed on co-produced research, but that in practice means being in at the very beginning when we agree what research we want in our community. And I know that's quite difficult to the way funding's done within, as my limited knowledge within in research, you know, in the world of academia. But there needs to be a shift. I mean, that's what I would say, in order to ensure that the research that takes place is co-produced and it meets the needs of the community and not the needs of the world of academia. That's just my little gripe for today, and I won't gripe anymore, I promise you. So we're fully aware of the issues that continue to keep us locked in poverty. We know that poverty is a structural and a policy issue. It's not an individual blame and people making bad mistakes or making bad choices and not doing enough to pull themselves out of poverty. We are hampered by the structural constraints around us. The issues are not merely confined to having sufficient income either, but in relation to a number of things, and these are just a few. Our poor life chances, insufficient well-paid jobs, real jobs with real wages that have a contract, not agency work, not 0 hours contracts, you know what I mean, unless you're choosing to do that because you've got another income in your house. Our life expectancy within our communities can be as much as 20 years, from those who live in a more affluent area to those who live in our deprived area. Now that tells you something. We have an inability to access services at the point of need. Unless we have money and can pay for private healthcare or private support services, we're unable to access the services and actually do some preventative work. Funding stopped within the voluntary and community sector, so the services that have been a lifeline are just decimated. We have limited opportunities. We have under-resourced schools. We have under-resourced higher education, or we have a need to either bring an income into the house or go on to university. And these are real difficult choices. We have inadequate public transport even, and we have restricted opportunities to participate in civic life. We don't always know where a ward councillor is. That information is not really made available unless we're online and going on the local authority website. We don't have, you know, the same prestige placed upon us, you know, and our time's not seen as precious as other people's times. And I might sound a bit cynical, but that's the reality. The insight from communities who've lived experience of poverty can pave the way for a more personal and human approach to anti-poverty policy and practice. We want to participate in a movement for social change, and I think we have that right to do so. We are a member of the community and society at large, and it's in nobody's interest to ensure it to continue with the widening inequality gaps. Insight, expertise and knowledge from communities who've been left behind and who are struggling to reach their potential is untapped. It's not valued, and it's not being considered in the same weight as other people's expertise. There is a rich resource that can be invaluable, and it's not good enough nor acceptable to be merely consulted with or be the subject of a survey, which is often the engagement mechanism within our local areas. If we continue to do the same things over and over again, we will continue to get the same results. Recent years have seen a rapid rise in levels of inequality, with millions of households experiencing poverty and all too often destitution. To be listened to, and not just listened to and not just heard, but this information then acted upon, has the potential to create an inclusive society. The policies that are made have a direct impact on our lives and our livelihoods, and it's important that we contribute to the debate that leads to decisions that have an impact on our life. For example, on a local level, having no control if a library is closed due to cuts to local authorities' funding can be devastating to communities. That's our hook into society, that's our hook into being connected, that's our hook into getting information. And if the funding's closed and the library's gone in our local community, then we're disconnected. I'll give you a quote from one person, just one of the many that we support and work with and who lead us in our work. And she says, it's important that people with lived experience are around the table when policies are made. And that table doesn't have to be the table in Westminster, it can be our table in our community centre. They are the ones who know what impact policy have on them, as they are the ones bearing the brunt of it. If policymakers don't listen to people with lived experience of poverty, the policies that they bring about won't change anything. People in poverty will suffer and will be worse off. Making a space at the table for people with lived experiences of poverty means that they can have a dialogue with policymakers and politicians to get their voice heard, to merge their areas of expertise so solutions can be formed. And to give a couple of examples whereby listening and acting upon the insight from people with lived experience in poverty can be invaluable, are as follows. So experts with lived experience of poverty quickly identified issues around the digital divide and around replacements for free school meals, but the government didn't listen. This led to reactive and knee-jerk policy making, where instead it could have been proactive, planned and timely. Things could have been different. So over the last few years, Apple members have not been silenced. We have amplified our voice, like I said earlier on. International Day for the Eradication is one of those days where we come together, we unite and we celebrate the fabulous work in the communities, and we draw attention to the insight and knowledge and expertise that's known. We've also participated in a lot of other things. We've debated in the House of Lords. We've attended various APPGs, all party parliamentary groups. We've contacted Metro Wares. We've contacted our local MPs. We regularly sign up and write articles and blogs and try and get them out in local media and national media. But again, unless we're respected for the insight and the value of our knowledge, then sometimes them doors are closed. So we have to develop relationships and we have to try to push them doors open. We shouldn't push the doors open, the doors should be opened. I want to end by saying one final comment. We are more than our story. And our experiences, our skills, our insight and our knowledge can be instrumental to affecting change. This is your opportunity to take stock of that and value that, and I hope you do. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Were you going to say anything as well, Katie, or are you going to come in on the Q&A?
I'll come in on the Q&A if that's all right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just wanted to check before moving on. Great, thank you. So yeah, thank you very much for that, Tracy. Some really thought-provoking comments there and some lessons I think we can all learn. And I can see as well that Katie's shared some links in the chat window. So I'd encourage the attendees to take a look at those. And if you don't manage to catch them, we can always send them by email. So just get in touch with our team. So our final speaker is Professor Glenn Bramley. Glenn is Professor of Urban Studies based in the Institute for Social Policy, Housing and Equalities Research, ISFIR, at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. With a background in urban economics, he's been engaging in research on housing, local services and poverty since 1973. Well known for work on planning, housing need and affordability and funding local services, his recent and current research has a major focus on poverty, destitution, severe or multiple disadvantages, and homelessness. So hand over to you now, Glenn.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and see my slides.
We can hear you, but we can't see the slides at the moment.
I don't know why that is. I've got them here.
So the share screen green button at the bottom of the
okay, give me a moment.
No problem.
And is that any better?
Yes, we've got them now. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thanks to Bristol Policy Institute and David Gordon for the invitation to this conference. I've had a connection with Dave since the late 1980s and with Bristol University since 1967. And I'm going to talk today about the extreme end of poverty in the UK, and I'm going to talk more about the quantitative approaches to analysis of this. So the title is Destitution in the UK, Measuring It and Modelling It. I'd like to acknowledge the key contribution of a whole team at my institute, which is Social Policy, Housing and Equalities Research at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, particularly Suzanne Fitzpatrick, who's overall led that programme, and Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who have funded it. What I'm going to cover briefly is a little bit about the motivation for this paper, this talk, brief outline of the research we've been doing on destitution since 2014, supported by Joseph Rowntree Foundation, then to focus on the definition that we use of destitution and its rationale, and then moving to the question of how we measure it, and contrasting two kinds of survey, the kind of the conventional household survey and a more specialized service user, survey of people using crisis services, which is the route we have used to measure destitution. But what I'm trying to do in this paper is to bolt these two methodologies together, these two types of surveys. And in order to make sense of that, you have to actually unpack and look more carefully at the definition of destitution and, as it were, the operational aspect of that as well as the formal aspect of it. And in doing that, I go back to our old friend, the Poverty and Social Exclusion Survey of 2012, which was a big study that Dave Gordon, of course, led. Having done that, I am then able to present a kind of a composite picture of destitution from drawing on both of those types of surveys and develop predictive models to look at the drivers and the factors associated with destitution and look at how those might impact on particular types of household with very different situations under the vignettes, and concluding with some next steps in this work. And my motivation for this really was that there was a rediscovery and a rising interest and concern with destitution in the UK, really from about 7 or 8 years ago onwards. Really, the concept of destitution was barely used in British social policy in the preceding 30 or 40 years. We would say that destitution is conceptually distinct, but the definition we've developed is rooted in the consensual approach to poverty, which we believe makes most sense here. And in that sense, it belongs in a broader stable with the Poverty and Social Exclusion Survey and the way it has influenced poverty measurement internationally. I have a particular concern that's been heightened by this work, that mainstream household surveys, which is the way that almost the entire edifice of statistics on poverty in the UK are presented, do not capture some of the more extreme conditions. What we did in the destitution research was we successfully developed a methodology that was really based on people that were actually presenting at services that tried to offer crisis support, mainly third sector services, only to a minimal extent statutory services. And that model seems to be successful, but ideally should ultimately be capable of integration with mainstream household surveys, such as Understanding Society, the panel survey, and the Family Resources Survey, which is the source of most of the official poverty measures. Bolting them together is possible, but forces a closer examination of the operational context of the definition. And then we can go on to develop these predictive models. And these shed light not just on destitution, but other related phenomena, like the use of food banks, forms of homelessness, including rough sleeping. So the destitution research itself, initiated in 2014, first survey 2015, we developed the definition, this consensus-based definition, which I'll show you in a moment. And we conducted surveys in 3 years, in 2015, 17 and 19, and we will conduct a fourth in 2022. In 2019, we got just under 4,000 responses in 1 week from 113 services in 18 localities. Secondary data analysis using a wide range of data, mainly at local authority level, enables to estimate the scale of destitution for all local authorities across Great Britain and up to the UK as a total. And a lot of qualitative follow-up interviews have been carried out. In the last round, those were mainly focused on how people who were destitute, had been destitute in the autumn of 2019, were coping under COVID. There's rich material from the qualitative research, which I will not be talking about today. This is the definition of destitution that we've used in these studies, and it seems to have been accepted or not very severely challenged, so we're continuing to work with it. There are two parts to the definition. Firstly, the first part is about extreme forms of material deprivation. And we have 6 items, and if people are lacking 2 or more of them in the last month because they cannot afford them, then they're destitute. And there's a shelter definition which focuses on rough sleeping. Anything more than 1 night of rough sleeping will count. Food, not having less than 2 meals a day for more than 2 days in the last month is the food criterion. Heating and lighting, being unable to heat or light your home for more than 5 days. Not having clothing and footwear appropriate for going outside in the weather. And basic toiletries, things like soap, shampoo, toothpaste and toothbrush. So some pretty basic items there. However, people can also be destitute if their income is so low and they have no savings that they are unable to purchase these essentials for themselves. And we went to quite a bit of trouble to define a level of income that we thought that was the case. And it's about just over £100 a week on the kind of equivalized AHC. That would be for a couple net after housing costs. Now, the scale of destitution in these studies, in the most recent study, we estimated at some point in 2019, over 1 million UK households were destitute. That included 2.4 million people, of whom more than half a million were children. And those numbers had increased by 35% in the 2.5 years since the spring of 2017. And the number of people had increased by more than 50%, and the number of children by more than 50%. So there had been a shift from a predominance of single-person households to rather more families and multi-person households being affected by destitution in that period. However, destitute households still tend in general to be younger and are still often single. A third nationally are homeless. That rises to 45% in London. Rates are highest in cities and declining industrial or coastal areas in the north and parts of London. Destitute households report many adverse experiences in the last year that have probably contributed to or exacerbated their material destitution. Drivers of growth, these we've summarized in our report, the typical things that we thought were particularly important in the period up to 2019. This is based on data from different sources, bring different sources together, including the qualitative side, secondary indicators, what the services we were working with actually said, and so on. And some of the statistical evidence. But the rollout of universal credit, we would probably say, was the #1 factor at that time, with its 5-week wait and its debt recovery from initial benefit payments, etc. Other benefit issues, including the cash freeze, rising problem debt, utilities, council tax, etc. Generally quite high numbers of migrants in the system, including those with the experience of asylum system, many of course with whom would not have recourse to public funds. rises in child poverty that are reflected in the official statistics as referred to by Peter earlier, high levels of homelessness, cumulative impacts of austerity on local authority budgets. However, we're making inferences, as I say, from a wide range of data. It would be good to be able to demonstrate through more formal modeling the quantitative significance of these factors. Now, this is reflecting on the two kinds of surveys that I'm trying to link together here. So on the left, you have your mainstream household surveys, like the Family Resources Survey or Understanding Society. And on the right, we have targeted surveys of users of crisis services, such as destitution in the UK. The advantages of the general household surveys is you have a large representative sample, which represents the mainstream population. You have a harmonized core of questions that have been well tested. You have full details of income, etc. Where there's a panel element to the survey, as in Understanding Society, you can measure change, recent change or longer period change. You can have variables that reflect people's situation in the previous year or change in the last year and so on. However, those surveys have limitations, and the number one limitation is that they do not cover people who are not in the private household population, or who have a tenuous connection with the household but are treated as temporary residents rather than usually resident when the survey interviewer comes around. Then there is a lot of non-response in these surveys, and in a sense, the more elaborate the surveys are, the worse the non-response. And you have a further problem if it's a panel survey, like Understanding Society, that you have attrition from wave to wave. And I think this is a serious problem that affects groups that we're particularly interested in, who are, if you like, on the economic margins, whose housing situation is unstable, and so on. Also, there are technical issues. A lot of the income and benefits data has to be imputed by computer algorithms or whatever. Anyway, maybe data linkage will improve that in the future. If we turn to targeted surveys, they have some obvious advantages, like the destitution survey. You have a sample, most of whose members are in the situations of interest. They are likely to be having the problems you're interested in. So you get quite a good sample of them in size times. You do capture key non-household groups, homeless people, people that are moving around. You capture various kind of, dare I call them, shy groups who may be a bit reluctant to participate in official sounding exercises, migrants, for example. And we've enhanced the representation of those groups by having a survey questionnaire translated into 26 languages that were commonly found to be in use in the areas where we were studying, that we were doing case studies. It can be structured to be representative of the defined sectors as they are present in the areas we're studying. We use local knowledge to build the map of all the services operating in each area we study. And we can gross up using the various factors, including questions about people's frequency of usage of different services over the last year. That's how we get our national annual estimates. There are limitations, though. It broadly doesn't cover people who are both housed and stably housed in households and are not in crisis and are therefore not using these services. And from that point of view, it's not ideal for modeling factors associated with whether people are in crisis or not, because we haven't got enough people who aren't to feed to calibrate the model. It's difficult to collect so much detail on things like income and benefits in this kind of survey. And so we also have to do quite a bit of imputation on some variables. This is perhaps the most difficult slide to read, but it's an attempt to provide a Venn diagram to show the various groups that we're trying to reach and which of them are caught by the different types of surveys. So if you like, the boxes on the left, which I've called B, A and B, are people who are not in private households, where the people to the right are people who are in private households. The upper part, where we've got the horizontal division, are people who do use crisis services, where the people below that line are the people who are not using crisis services. The group F over to the right are the vast majority of households who are well housed and are settled and are not in immediate risk and are not using crisis services. Groups C1 and C2 are people who are in private households, but are in the non-responding or attrition categories. And so the surveys are not actually collecting data about them, even though they are in households. When we measure destitution in the UK, we measure it from categories B, C1, and D. And we are implicitly assuming that there are not too many people in categories A and C2. And then category E can be picked up. This is people in private households who might be surveyed by a general household survey, but are not using crisis services. We can pick them up if we do a composite approach that uses, say, a survey like Understanding Society, as well as the destitution survey, as in this exercise. A word or two about the role of income in this. Under our standard definition, a household can be destitute either because they lack key material essentials or because they have this very, very low income and no savings. And we included this second criterion to reflect certain key judgments that we developed after consultation and checking with public opinion on this, that people should not have to rely on charity. And they should not have to rely on, like, food banks or on friends, non-close relatives, to give them enough resources and income or material things to avoid destitution. That's not okay. And so that if their income is very low, is below this kind of £100 level, then if they weren't destitute last month, they will be next month or the month after if things carry on like that. That also, another consideration might be, for example, victims of domestic violence and abuse who suddenly lose their home, suddenly lose their income or their source of income. So that's why we included that second criterion as an or rather than an and. However, if you then go to general household surveys like Understanding Society and try to implement the same definition, you find that you actually have rather a lot of cases that seem to have very low incomes, and but they don't necessarily appear to be critically deprived of essentials. And various authors such as Mike Brewer and the IFS and so on have drawn attention to this group over a number of years. And there are various reasons why people's incomes may fluctuate, notably self-employed people whose incomes can go up and down and so on. But if a household does suffer...
Sorry, Glenn, we are over time now, so if you could start to wrap up, that would be great.
Yes, okay, I'm sorry, I have not appreciated that. With difficulty, I want to just say I have investigated using the PSE survey, some aspects of this definition to try to refine the definition to make it applicable within surveys like Understanding Society, and have then combined these two surveys together to produce a picture of the population that is sourced from the two surveys, as shown in this table here. But I won't go through the detail of that. I've also established models to predict likelihood of destitution using this combined data set, which produces models that have pretty good properties in terms of fit to the data, and show a lot of, then give us a more quantitative picture of the influence of the key variables that may well be driving destitution, which are listed in this table here that I haven't got time to go through, but it does give us, for example, on the question of the universal credit, that is one of the most strongest variables influencing destitution in this period, as was suggested previously. So that's just one example. And we can also do vignettes, which look at the risks for households that have particular characteristics, and shows that there is extreme variation in the risk of experiencing destitution between different households in different circumstances. So just to conclude, the next steps in this work I think are to listed here really, further exploration of the scope of these models. And in particular, I think this has the potential for us to do more kind of micro simulation of both who we would expect to be destitute and if there's a shock to the system like COVID, who is that going to affect? What new people is that going to bring into the system? And we did do some work of that kind in a study for the Trussell Trust a few months ago. I think we're planning the next round of destitution, so I think this should influence our thinking about possible additional work we might do in the next round of the research. I'm actively using models of the kind I've just briefly illustrated to you in current work to forecast homelessness and project homelessness as a function of policy changes and contextual changes. And finally, this sort of work is feeding into the deliberations of something called the Inclusive Data Task Force, which Dave Gordon is a member of. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Glenn. Some really interesting data there, and obviously we've got the slides with which we can share with your permission online, and hopefully follow up with people who are interested. So we've had a few questions through the Q&A window, which is fantastic. Do keep them coming. If we don't get to your question, please do get in touch with us, and we're happy to pass on to the speakers. We've got about 10 minutes for the Q&A, so I'll get through as many as I can, and I'll try and get a balance across our panel members, as well as covering a range of topics. So I'll ask the speakers to please keep your answers brief as far as possible, just so we can get through them, but obviously recognising that you need to give a full answer to contextualise your comments. So first one we've got is from Clara Piri. I see that Katie has provided some response in the Q&A window, but she had a question for Tracy. She said that she found your talk really insightful. Thank you for sharing on the issue of co-production and really involving people in deciding what research would benefit the community, not just being researched. Do you know of any examples that you think have done this well?
I think obviously there's a good piece of work with COVID realities that's happened. I think that's in New York area, but I might be wrong with the geographics there. We've got a trustee who's also a PhD student, so we've come up with a number of guidelines to work with universities and how to do this good. And I think it's in the early stages, but I think particularly more relevant is new PhD students coming through to develop a relationship with their community and then inform the research. So it's slow but sure, and I'm guessing there's a few more examples out there. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. And I see that Katie's put another link in the chat window, which will take you to more information about that, I believe. So that's really helpful, thank you. So our next question is from Patricio Oliveira for Professor Gordon. So it says, thank you very much for your presentation. Regarding the probable increase in inequality with and after the pandemic, what would be the drivers of that process? And are there differences between regions, for example, between Latin America and Europe?
The drivers are that during the pandemic, there's a loss of jobs and a loss of income, and that tends to differentiately affect those on the most tenuous jobs and the lowest paid jobs. It tends to be dramatically worse in lower and middle income countries than it is in the high income countries, although it does have big impacts in the high income countries. If particularly during national lockdowns, in order to protect the population's health, if people can't go to work and earn a living, and they don't have resources to draw upon, then they can fall rapidly into a spiral of poverty. The pandemic itself is likely to kill and cause long-term illness to the people at the bottom of society, the poorest, than it is to the richest, particularly where there's medical care has to be paid for. We're witnessing some terrible scenes in India at the moment, and also in Brazil. And therefore you're likely to lose family members and breadwinners as well. So pandemics tend to have multiple impacts, and they tend to differentially impact the poor. And that's been true for thousands of years, unfortunately. Governments need to actively intervene to prevent these devastating impacts.
Great, thank you, David. So we've got a question from Amal Karaki. Doesn't specify who it's for in the panel, so I'll just put it out there and see who wants to come in on it. So I was asking, are these systems in place really addressing the root causes of poverty and its impact, or is it easier for those systems to keep providing services that address the symptoms?
Hi, Lauren. I'll have a first stab at that if that's okay. So, yeah, so I think it's the systems that humans have designed these systems, so it's trying to look and see, well, what can they do to actually propel people out of poverty? So the benefit system can be designed. It's designed by humans, it can be redesigned. And so I think that's something that we can look at. So, some of the things that Glenn was mentioning about the benefit system, like the 5-week wait, like some of the welfare reforms, they're things that are a part of the system but don't have to be. And so, it can be made to be a more of a kind of poverty fighting social security system. Similarly, kind of controls on 0-hour contracts and things like that can be put in place to improve the system. So I think that's one of the key areas of action where things can be improved.
Also, as well, is when you talk about social security benefits, the other thing to add in there, and I know you touched on it briefly, Peter, earlier on, was about legacy benefits. So when you're doing an uplift to universal credit and you haven't done one to, that's a decision that could be made. And also around debt deductions within social security benefits, it's against the system. Government have shown that they could pause the recovery of debt. And we're looking at a piece of work as well around, government debt is increased dramatically and outstretching now, private debt. But government borrowing, the way that they get the money back is not working. You know what I mean? They're not following good practice guidelines there, so it's pushing people into further debt. And then even examples around housing, decent homes housing standards, things like that. And there are things that can be done when you merge the areas of expertise and find the solutions that can work and make a difference in communities.
Yeah, definitely.
Can I come in as well on this one, Glenn here? I think that while I agree broadly that the sort of broader structural things, the kind that Peter talked about in terms of jobs, housing affordability and so on, will have a big impact overall on poverty, and the benefit system issues that have just been mentioned are really important at the moment. I think when you look at destitution, you do get some more, like, if you like, harder cases, if you like, of people who have more complex needs. And in some of that sector, sometimes there is a need to rethink, instead of the services dealing with the same people over time, but not fundamentally resolving their problems. There are innovations there and things that perhaps do need more resources targeted in, like the Housing First initiatives that are now being tried with wraparound support that's more flexibly related to the situation of those people, and with better rehab services to support them in place and so forth. So in some situations that may be relevant.
Just to add to that, in the UK, there's no mystery about how to reduce and eventually eradicate poverty during the 21st century. We've seen a dramatic reduction in pensioner poverty. We saw for the first 10 years of this century a reduction in family and child poverty. Unfortunately, those policies were reversed and it's going back up. We have the means and we have the knowledge how to do it. On an international scale, it's a question of governments actually beginning to implement anti-poverty policies, particularly anti-poverty policies for children. They can be expensive initially, but in the long term, they are of a massive economic benefit, even in the poorest countries. And some countries need to develop social security systems. They need to develop job creation systems for their young population as they get to adulthood and want to go into the labour market.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So we've just got a couple of, I think, more comments than questions in the window, and then we'll have to wrap up because we're close to time. So we've got a comment from Bongai Munguni, who she says, have also been research findings, dissemination to the communities research. For example, if a poverty study is done in a community, then the findings are presented to the people at a community-like conference where the king, head men and head women and all the community people are invited to hear the findings and police the recommendations. So she thinks that research outcomes feedback can help more to the communities on top of co-production, engaging the communities at both ends of the process, and I think throughout as well is the kind of key message there, which is absolutely very important to factor in. And the final, well, it's sort of a question, but we haven't got time to address it. So it's more of a thought out to the audience and the panel, is about perhaps training and enabling peer researchers. So people with that lived experience being involved in the research process, I believe is what they mean by that. Apologies, it's from Anonymous, so I'm not sure who asked it, but they just suggest that could be a useful consideration and process for the future. So apologies, we are pretty much out of time, so I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of our wonderful speakers for their fantastic and thought-provoking presentations. Thank you also to all the participants for engaging with the discussion and for your questions when they came up. And we've got a slide on screen at the moment with information on our links, etc., for you to access other details. Just a quick reminder, this event has been recorded and will be available via the BPI website soon, where you can watch it back, and you can share the link with friends or colleagues who you think might be interested, who weren't able to come today. And you can also watch any other conference sessions coming up, which you, if you missed them, in the next couple of days. Also just wanted to remind all participants that Bristol University Press have created a virtual space so they can connect with everyone they would have done if this were a physical event. They're also offering 50% off a selection of their latest books, as well as free content from the Journal of Poverty and Social Justice to all attendees of this conference. So a link to their page can be found on our 4 Waves event website at the bottom of the schedule tab. And if you have any problems, just get in touch with my team and we'll be able to help you. Coming up later today are discussions on poverty measurements, inequalities in child health and early child development in disadvantaged environments. So do check out the conference programs for details and links. And we hope you can join us for what's shaping up to be a fantastic program of activities and a brilliant array of presenters and participants. Finally, do engage with the online discussions on our Twitter account at Bristol Poverty and conference hashtag BPI Conference 2021. And yeah, join us after the break for the next event, which is Policy and Poverty Measurement, featuring presentations from researchers from Luxembourg, Japan, South Africa and Sweden, and chaired by my wonderful colleague, Dr. Mary Zhang. So we're going to take a break now and hopefully see you in the next session at 11:30.